Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she notices something others dismissed, a single glove, left behind in a quiet church pew. To most, it seemed nothing, but to her, it whispered of guilt, of secrets, and of a hand that had far more to hide. Stay with me till the end, because this clue doesn't just lead to an answer, it unravels a chilling truth. So, pour yourself a cup of tea and settle in, because today's case will keep you guessing until the final moment. Chapter 1. The Pew by the Pillar. It began, as most things in St. Petronella's did, with the bells. They rang out every Sunday at precisely 10 minutes to 9, cheerful, insistent, a little off-key, and summoned the faithful of Lower Milchester to their familiar places. Among the stone pews and centuries-old arches, St. Petronella's church had stood for nearly 400 years, and if its walls were a little cracked and its hymnals a little worn, it was all the better for it. To the villagers, it was a place of gentle ritual, where the seasons passed in. Blooming window boxes and the vicar's sermon rarely rose above a sleepy murmur. So when something unusual occurred, however slight, it created a ripple. The morning in question was overcast, the sort of damp English gray that made even the yews look uncertain. The congregation filed in with damp umbrellas and polished shoes. Miss Jane Marple arrived in her usual manner, quietly, on foot, and 5 minutes early. She took her customary place in the third pew from the front on the left side, just beneath the small plaque honoring a minor viscount no one remembered but everyone respected. She settled her gloves on her lap, clasped her hands, and observed. Not the altar, not the vicar fumbling with his notes, but the congregation. Myrrh and Mrs. Hartridge bickering about the offertory envelope. Young Lucy Barnes arriving without her mother for the first time. And just behind the marble pillar on the far right, a change, pew 8. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Pew 8 was usually empty. It was shadowed by the column and tucked beside the vestry door, avoided by habit. And yet today, a man sat there, unfamiliar, middle-aged, clean-cut, slight stoop in the shoulders. His coat was old but brushed, his expression absent. She would have thought little of it, except for what happened next, midway through the final hymn. Just as the organ wheezed out the last bars of Abide With Me, the man stood, paused strangely as if uncertain whether to turn left or right, then strode out. No one stopped him. He did not stay for tea and digestives, which was unusual. Everyone stayed for tea in Lower Milchester. It was the unspoken law of Sunday. It was Lucy Barnes who found the glove. It lay in pew 8. A man's leather glove, right-handed, dark brown, soft and clearly well cared for, but oddly damp. Lucy picked it up, looked around, and then handed it to Mrs. Eccles, the church warden, who turned it over thoughtfully and announced, "Strange sort of glove to forget." She placed it on the side table beside the biscuit tin, expecting someone to collect it after tea. No one did. By Monday morning, it had not been claimed. By Wednesday, it had been placed in the lost and found box behind the font. And by Thursday, Miss Marple knew something was wrong. She returned to the church that afternoon, not for prayer, but for pattern. Miss Marple believed that most things in life, including wrongdoing, followed a pattern. People did not change as often as they liked to believe. A careless glove, perhaps, but a careful man, sitting alone in an empty pew, in a church he did not belong to. Leaving without a word, she stepped quietly into pew 8. She sat, from this angle. The rest of the church felt distant, blurred by the presence of the pillar and the thick velvet curtain that led to the vestry. It was a place one could hide in plain sight. From here, one could see almost everything. but be seen by no one. And under the edge of the pew in front of her, she noticed a scrape, a small one, fresh. As if something had been wedged there, or pulled out in haste. She ran her fingers along the wood smoothed by years of hymn book thumbing and found, pressed into the groove beneath the seat, a sliver of card. She withdrew it carefully. A calling card. No name, only a London address, Griffin Street, Mayfair, elegant, expensive. The sort of place where gloves weren't often forgotten. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, sat down in her parlor, and did two things. First, she rang the London Directory Service and asked about Griffin Street. The operator found for entries. One matched the address exactly, Arlington and Bray, solicitors. Second, she looked at the glove again. She had retrieved it from the church box on the excuse of having once lost something similar. It was heavier than she remembered. She turned it inside out. Nothing. She ran her fingers along the lining again, felt for a seam, pressed. And found, just above the wrist, the faintest crunch. Paper. With her embroidery scissors, she made a discreet cut and pulled out a folded scrap, tightly compressed, scented faintly of tobacco and lavender. She unfolded it. A torn page from a diary. March 3rd. I saw her again. She does not know I'm watching. She still wears the brooch. If she ever finds out the truth, it must be destroyed before the 10th. Miss Marple laid the slip on the table outside. The afternoon faded into drizzle, but inside, the first line of a mystery had already been written. And this time, the story had begun not with a scream or a body but with a single, forgotten glove, left behind in a pew no one used, unless they were hiding. Chapter 2. Gossip over biscuits. Friday morning. The gossip in Lower Milchester had found its rhythm. Not yet scandal, but speculation in its early bloom. The glove, as expected, had become the subject of murmured theories at Mrs. Temple's bake stall, the post office counter, and along the short gravel path behind the church where 3 widow pensioners often walked in tandem. He must have been in a rush, said Mrs. Tilling, the butcher's wife, as she rang up Miss Weatherby's half-pound of ham. Left the moment the hymn ended. Almost rude, really, no name on the glove, said Miss Weatherby with narrowed eyes. Just leather and mystery. That sort of thing never bodes well. Perhaps he was in mourning, offered Mrs. Tilling mildly. Perhaps, said Miss Weatherby, but people in mourning don't sit in empty pews like shadows and vanish without their gloves. Miss Marple heard all of this, quietly observing the rhythm of village curiosity from her spot in the queue at the grocer's. She had long understood that truth, in places like Lower Milchester, emerged not from statements, but from repetition. The details that remained unchanged were the ones that mattered, and 2 things were being repeated already. No one recognized the man, and no one saw him arrive. That latter fact troubled her. Lower Milchester was not the sort of place one simply arrived in unnoticed. There was a single road into the village, and on a Sunday morning, anyone unfamiliar would be spotted by at least 3 sets of eyes, one from the tea window, one from the vicarage, and one from the Hartridge twins, who were notorious for noting the make and model of every vehicle that passed. And yet, no one had seen the man enter or leave. Miss Marple spent the early afternoon tidying her cupboards, a task that always helped her thoughts find order. The card from Griffin Street sat beneath a pressed handkerchief in the drawer by her kettle. The diary scrap was folded and placed in an envelope, waited under the sugar bowl. By 3:30, she set out with a tin of Sultana biscuits for her weekly visit to Mrs. Lavinia Eversham, the retired organist and a living encyclopedia of the parish's pew arrangements, funeral lineups, and anything written in the margins of the church's hymnals. Lavinia received her in a red armchair with crocheted antimacassars and a lap full of crossword clippings. "Jane," she said, as if Miss Marple's arrival was both expected and overdue, "don't tell me you've come about the glove. "I've brought biscuits," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But I confess I was hoping for your thoughts." Lavinia accepted the biscuits and poured tea without ceremony. "Pew 8, she said at last. "No one uses it. Not since old Mr. Dobbins passed. Bit too close to the vestry and too shaded by the pillar. It's a good place to listen, mind you. You can hear every hymn note, every cough. No one ever looks that way. Odd place to sit for a stranger," Miss Marple mused aloud. "Odd place for a visitor altogether," Lavinia agreed. "Strangers don't come to St. Petronella's unless they've reason. And this one, he had a reason. You could see it on his face. He was waiting for someone or something." He kept glancing toward the choir stalls. That drew Miss Marple's attention. "The choir. Only once or twice, discreet. But I saw it. My eyes aren't what they were, but I still know when someone's pretending not to look." Miss Marple took a contemplative sip of tea. "Do you remember what he looked like?" "40s, I'd say. Hair thinning, pale, nice coat. Gloves well, you know, and very clean fingernails. London hands, not gardening hands, that fit." Miss Marple let her gaze drift toward the mantel, where Lavinia kept a line of porcelain birds and a faded photograph of her late husband. Something tickled the edge of her thoughts, but it wasn't ready yet. Not quite. Instead, she asked, "Has anyone new joined the choir recently?" Lavinia's brows rose. "As a matter of fact, yes. A young woman, Violet Dean, from the city, staying with her aunt. Pretty voice and eyes like a trapped fox. Only joined 3 weeks ago." Miss Marple placed her teacup down slowly. "I don't believe I know the aunt. Came here years ago. Quiet woman. Miss Hemmings. Lives on Mill Lane, near the old dairy. Keeps to herself. Rarely at services, but made an exception last month too. Bring Violet in." The connections began to tighten like threads, gathering into a net. A woman new to the choir. A man sitting where he wouldn't be seen but could watch. A glove, carefully forgotten, and a diary page mentioning her. "She does not know I'm watching." Miss Marple rose after a final sip of tea and excused herself, leaving behind the tin of biscuits and a promise to return with clippings from last week's parish newsletter. Instead, she made her way down Mill Lane. Miss Hemmings's house was the third on the left, low stone, ivy choked, the front window curtained tightly even in the daylight. She knocked. It was Violet who answered. She was younger than expected, perhaps in her mid-20s, with pale skin, auburn hair pinned severely, and a voice that carried the crispness of someone who had been taught not to trust softness. "Miss Marple?" "Yes, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "I was hoping to speak with your aunt." "She's resting," Violet said after a pause. "She tires easily, of course. I won't trouble you. I was only admiring the window box. Your pansies are doing splendidly for this time of year." Violet blinked. "Thank you. I planted them myself. They do say pansies remember things," Miss Marple said, "which is perhaps why they make such excellent witnesses." There was a long pause. Then Violet stepped back. "Would you like to come in?" Miss Marple smiled gently and entered. Inside, the air smelled of rose water and something faintly metallic, like dried blood beneath a bandage. As Violet poured tea in the dim parlor, Miss Marple studied her more closely. She wasn't frightened. She was watching, like someone expecting someone else entirely, like someone waiting for a man who once sat in a church pew and forgot his glove. Chapter 3, Secrets Beneath the Surface. Tea Violet poured was jasmine, fragrant and pale, with steam rising in coiling threads, but Miss Marple noted that her hostess did not drink it. She merely filled both cups, handed one with a steady hand, and then took the farthest chair by the window, where she sat stiffly, fingers laced. Miss Marple took a polite sip, watching the girl closely. Violet Dean had a beauty that was almost fragile, clear features, careful posture, and the faintest tension in the throat. as if she were always swallowing something back. "I've heard your singing," Miss Marple began gently. "At St. Petronella's, a lovely voice." "Thank you," Violet replied without a smile. "I was trained at a conservatoire before I came here. Do you find village life much changed from the city?" Violet nodded slowly. "Quieter, less complicated, but not always easier." That, Miss Marple thought, was not the kind of thing a young woman said lightly. She set her cup on the small table beside her and folded her hands. "I don't mean to intrude," she said, "but I had the sense on Sunday that someone was watching you during the service." Violet looked up quickly. Her eyes, blue and sharp, met Miss Marple's with something close to alarm but not surprise. "You saw him," she said flatly. "I did." Violet was silent for a long moment. The hands in her lap twisted slightly, then stilled. "I thought he might come. Who is he?" Miss Marple asked softly. "A mistake," Violet said, her voice low. "One I tried to forget." Miss Marple didn't press her. She had learned long ago that people, especially young women, told you things when you left just enough space for them to breathe. Violet stared down at her hands. "I knew him in London. He was charming at first, attentive, but it changed. He became possessive, controlling when I tried to end it. He said I'd regret it, that he'd follow me anywhere." "Did he ever hurt you?" Violet hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Not in ways that left bruises, but yes." Miss Marple's voice was very calm. "And so you left?" "Yes, I came here. My mother's sister, Aunt Joan, offered to take me in. It was supposed to be temporary. I joined the choir because I thought I might feel normal again." "And did you?" Violet looked toward the curtained window. For a while, Miss Marple's fingers tapped gently against her teacup. "Do you know if he's still in the village?" "I don't know," Violet said, though her voice trembled. "I saw someone outside the church 2 nights ago. Just a shadow behind the light gate. I didn't stop to look." Miss Marple considered this. "And does your aunt know anything about him?" Violet shook her head. "She's very old-fashioned. I told her I left for personal reasons. She doesn't ask questions." Miss Marple gave a kind smile. "That's rather generous of her. She means well. But she sleeps most of the day now. I think she's slipping." Miss Marple stood. "Well, my dear, if ever you feel unsafe or in need of a listener, my door is always open. It's what we do best in villages, listening." Violet looked grateful, though still guarded. "Thank you, Miss Marple." As Miss Marple stepped back out onto Mill Lane, she felt the chill in the air sharpen. Something in Violet's manner rang true, but there were notes beneath the melody that remained unresolved. She made her way slowly back to her cottage, passing the post office where Mrs. Finch was pinning up a new notice about a charity bake sale. The moment she saw Miss Marple, she bustled out. "Oh, Jane, I was meaning to tell you. That young woman, Miss Dean, from the choir, someone posted a letter for her yesterday. No return address, but the stamp was London. No one ever gets post from London except the solicitor." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Did she collect it?" "First thing this morning." "Did she say anything?" "Not a word, but she turned quite pale when I handed it to her." "Did you happen to notice the handwriting?" Mrs. Finch's eyes sparkled. "I did. Very fine. Tall capitals, slanted slightly left." Miss Marple nodded. "That matched the note hidden inside the glove dot by the time she reached her garden gate." Her mind had begun assembling the fragments into something troubling. Violet had a secret. Someone knew it, and that someone had come not only to watch but to send warnings, quietly slipped into gloves and letters. Each note weighted with meaning known only to them. She went inside and pulled out the diary scrap again. "She still wears the brooch." Miss Marple frowned. She hadn't noticed. A brooch on Violet, which meant either the note wasn't written about her, or Violet no longer wore it. That night, as the village quieted and the mist returned, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting slowly. She thought about the glove, about the address on the card, Griffin Street, Arlington and Bray, solicitors. She had assumed the glove's contents pointed to Violet, but perhaps it pointed to something else entirely, something deeper, older. The truth, she felt, was not about who had arrived last Sunday. But about what had happened before they did. Chapter 4. The Brooch That Wasn't Thereth. Following morning brought with it a hard frost unexpected for early April, and Lower Milchester's lawns and hedgerows glistened beneath a thin shell of white. Miss Marple wrapped herself in her plum-colored shawl and took her usual walk to the baker's, basket in hand. The frost had done wonders for the roses outside the vicarage, and her steps, though slow, were purposeful. She had decided it was time to visit the solicitor. Griffin Street, Mayfair, was not the sort of address found on ordinary business cards, and Arlington and Bray elegant, discreet, and expensive were well known in certain circles, particularly those involving delicate inheritances and family embarrassments. The sort of place one went to quietly disappear or reappear with reputation intact. Of course, Miss Marple had no intention of traveling to London herself, not when a perfectly good nephew worked in the capital and owed her at least 3 favors: a quick letter to Raymond with precise wording, a discreet inquiry about the nature of their clientele, particularly any recent activity involving a Mr. P.W. or Miss V.D., would be enough to set the matter in motion. She posted it before Elevensses. She returned home to find an envelope on her doormat. Cream, thick, no return address, the handwriting unmistakable, fine, tall, left slanted capitals. Her name was printed on the front. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside, a single sheet of paper, typed, "Some things are not meant to be dug up, Miss Marple. Let the dead lie, and no more gloves will be lost. We are watching to." No signature, no other marks. But the paper was faintly scented lavender water, the same scent she'd noted in Violet's parlor. She set the letter on the mantelpiece and stared at it for a long time. Whoever had written it knew she was close, or wanted her to believe she was. She sat down at her writing desk and opened her notebook, drawing a careful line beneath her previous notes. Threat received, anonymous. Connection to Violet suggested via sent but possibly false trail. Reference to gloves plural, meaning there may be more, or that the original is not the only clue. She tapped her pen against her chin, then circled a previous entry, brooch, mentioned in glove note, but not observed on Violet. It was time to ask. She returned to Mill Lane after tea, walking with a basket of seed packets and early primrose cuttings as her cover. She knocked twice. This time, it was Miss Hemmings who answered. The woman was thin and papery, with soft eyes that drifted slightly as she tried to place Miss Marple. Her voice was high and polite, and she wore a cardigan with darning in both elbows. Oh yes, the knitting lady. From the church, she said vaguely. Violet's gone to choir practice. Miss Marple smiled. Just as well. I was hoping to see you, Miss Hemmings. The old woman looked surprised, but pleased. Oh, how very kind. I brought some primroses, Miss Marple said, holding up the basket. They've taken very well in my east border, and I thought you might enjoy a few by your window. Miss Hemmings ushered her in without hesitation. The parlor was dim and overheated, with lace over every surface and a clutter of tea tins on the mantel. The same scent lingered here, lavender and something mustier. Beneath it, faintly, Miss Marple caught the trace of pipe smoke. She hadn't noticed it before. Do you take lodgers? She asked gently as she handed over the primroses. Miss Hemmings blinked. No, not since 1949. Violet helps with the shopping. We keep to ourselves. Quite right, Miss Marple said. And is she settling in well? She has a strong voice, Miss Hemmings said vaguely. And she keeps her room very tidy. I imagine she'll marry a choir master. Miss Marple smiled. I was wondering about her brooch. Miss Hemmings blinked. Brooch. She used to wear one, didn't she? Before she joined the choir. The old woman's brow furrowed. Oh yes, a little silver forget-me-not. Wore it every day. It was her mother's. Has she stopped? I suppose so. I haven't seen it lately. She said she lost it in the move. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I'm terribly sorry. She said after a moment. You said no lodgers, but I noticed a scent in the parlor. Lavender, of course, but also pipe tobacco. Very old, a man's blend. Balkan so brainy, I think. Miss Hemmings flushed faintly. You must have a good nose. I used to buy it for my brother. I imagine Violet doesn't smoke. No, said Miss Hemmings quickly. Of course not. Miss Marple rose after a few more pleasant minutes and left the basket behind. Once out on the road again, she made for the vicarage. Reverend Felix Albright greeted her with his usual air of studied disorder, spectacles askew. Cassock stained with tea, Miss Marple, he said. You're several steps ahead of me, I'm sure. Only a few, I suspect. I was wondering if you've seen the visitor from last Sunday again. The gentleman in pew 8. He asked. No, not a sign. Did he speak to you at all? No, but Mrs. Tilling told me she spotted him last week on the edge of the green, near the bus shelter. He appeared to be watching the church, though when she turned to wave, he vanished. Did she say what he looked like? Not in detail, but she did mention a brooch. Miss Marple stopped. A brooch? She asked. Yes, on his lapel. Silver, she thought. Small and floral. She thought it odd, but assumed it was a memorial pin or something of that sort. Miss Marple's pulse slowed. She's quite sure. She said it gleamed in the sunlight. Miss Marple's thoughts raced that the brooch had not been lost. It had been taken, and now it was being worn mockingly, perhaps by a man pretending to be something. He was not, or someone. She returned home and unlocked the small wooden drawer beside her bed. Inside was the glove. She turned it inside out again and examined the lining a second time. The tiny slit where she had retrieved the note was not alone. Another fold in the fabric. This one deeper, nearly invisible, just a stitched pocket at the cuff's base. She pried it gently open. Inside, a photograph, folded twice, creased, grayscale, a man smiling tightly, a hand on the shoulder of a girl, young, perhaps 8, the same eyes as Violet, but the man's tie bore a familiar insignia, Griffin Street, Arlington and Bray. She turned the photo over in fading pencil. For V when you're ready. P.W. Miss Marple stared at the fire. The man in the photo was not a stranger to Violet. He was her father, and someone, either him or someone claiming to be him, had returned, wearing a brooch that should never have left her coat. Chapter 5. A man who wasn't supposed to return. By the time Miss Marple had finished her tea that evening, the fire had begun to hiss low in the grate, and the weight of her discovery pressed against her like a winter shawl to heavily wear upon. The photograph, faded, creased, and quietly explosive, now lay atop her notebook. Its folded edges trembled slightly in the draft from the keyhole, but the meaning within it was steady as stone. P.W., the same initials she had noted when corresponding with Raymond about Arlington and Bray. The name, though still unconfirmed, had begun to circle the edges of her thoughts with a kind of ominous clarity. Peter Wendell. The name had come up once before, years ago, in relation to a messy estate dispute a man thought to have absconded with his child's inheritance, before vanishing altogether. A solicitor's clerk at Arlington and Bray, the sort who wore tidy suits and vanished at lunch for reasons never explained. Not quite disreputable, but never quite accounted for either. And now, it seemed, he was here, or someone claiming to be. She thought of the photograph, the letter hidden in the glove, the mention of the brooch, all things tied not only to Violet, but to her past one she had clearly tried to bury. Miss Marple rose and crossed to the mantel, where the anonymous note from earlier that day still rested. "We are watching too." There was a cruelty to that plural "we," as if the watcher was not alone. And perhaps he wasn't. She tucked the photo and note back into her notebook, then stepped into the hallway and donned her coat. There was one more place she needed to visit before the village closed in for the night: the rectory. It was nearly 6:30 when she arrived. The light was on Reverend Albright's study, and his dog, a sleepy spaniel named Parsnip, lifted its head just long enough to wag a tail before curling back beneath the window. The vicar welcomed her warmly. "Ah, Miss Marple. Something tells me this is not a social call." "Observant as always, Reverend," she said, stepping inside. "I'm afraid it concerns a matter of identity, and a very dangerous one at that." They sat in the small study, surrounded by rows of theological texts and a surprisingly large number of gardening books. Miss Marple explained everything she had learned about the photograph, the glove, the brooch, the brooding man in the pew. Reverend Albright listened intently, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing with every turn in the tale. "And you believe this man is impersonating her father?" he asked finally. "I believe he is her father," Miss Marple replied, "but that his return is not as sentimental as he would like us to believe." Reverend Albright frowned. "That would make him—" "What a threat? A blackmailer?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "A reminder. And reminders, Reverend, are sometimes more dangerous than weapons." A silence followed. Then the vicar said, "I'll speak with Violet. Quietly. I'll ask her to come to the vestry after Sunday's service. No questions. Just a private conversation. If the man appears again, we'll have reason to detain him, if not legally, then socially." Miss Marple smiled faintly. There are few forces in England more powerful than a well-timed vestry chat. She thanked him and made her way back through the quiet village. The frost had begun to return, and the moon cast a soft sheen over the rooftops of Lower Milchester. But inside her mind, the edges of the story had begun to sharpen. This was no longer simply a case of a glove dot. It was a question of return, of inheritance, of fear, and somewhere in the web was Violet, a girl with a hidden history and a voice that trembled like church glass. When Miss Marple arrived home, she found a letter waiting on her doorstep. No envelope, just a single folded note written in the same elegant, slanted hand. "You shouldn't have asked about the brooch. Some things belong in the past. Let them rot there." The message had been placed deliberately, no stamp, no seal. Just a statement left in silence. Miss Marple folded it once, then twice, and set it on top of her earlier notes. She didn't need further warning. She understood precisely what it meant, but she had never been one to step away from rot, not when it threatened to strangle the roots of something fragile like truth. The next morning, she rose early and made her way to the village green, and there she found him, the man. He stood near the edge of the light gate, hands in his coat pockets, staring toward the church as if waiting for bells that wouldn't ring. Miss Marple approached without hesitation. "You left something," she said, voice even. He turned, startled, but only slightly. "You've been watching," she continued. "You left the glove, the letters, and the brooch." The man's eyes narrowed. "You should mind your own business." "I always do," she said cheerfully. "It just so happens that my business is human nature. And you, sir, are behaving rather poorly." His smile was thin. "You think you've solved it, don't you? That I'm some specter come to haunt my daughter?" "You're not a ghost," Miss Marple said quietly. "But you are hiding, and if Violet recognizes you on Sunday, we shall all know exactly what you're hiding from." For a moment, the man's composure slipped. Then, just as quickly, it returned. "You'll regret meddling." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I rarely do, but I dare say you might." She turned and walked away, leaving him in the cold light of morning, standing like a statue with nothing left to say. Chapter 6. The Man in the Choir Loft. Be Sunday morning. The frost had melted into dew, and the sky hung low and white, like a ceiling pressed to close. The village of Lower Milchester, bundled in scarves and stiff collars, made its way to St. Petronella's with the ritual quiet of a community steeped in habit. Miss Marple arrived early, as always, but this time she did not enter through the front gate. Instead, she circled quietly round the side of the church, following the narrow gravel path that led to the vestry. From there, through the small leaded glass window beside the light gate, she could observe both the entrance and the south aisle, pew 8 included. She did not have to wait long. 10 minutes before the bell, the man appeared. He was dressed as before, dark coat, brown gloves, hair slicked back with the care of a man who once cared about appearances. He paused at the gate, not nervously, but with the hesitation of someone waiting to be watched. Then he entered the church and slipped again into pew 8, shadowed by the marble pillar. Miss Marple noted the exact moment Violet arrived. She stepped in with the choir procession, wearing her usual pale blue coat and soft gloves, her eyes downcast. As the vicar led the procession up the aisle, Miss Marple observed Violet's shoulders tense, not dramatically, but just enough to catch the attention of someone who knew the signs. Violet had seen him. Whether she recognized him, Miss Marple couldn't yet tell. Inside the church, the service passed with careful, almost theatrical stillness. Hymns rose, prayers fell. The sermon wandered gently through a parable about forgiveness. But Miss Marple's attention never left the movement in the far corner, how the man leaned slightly each time the choir stood, how his eyes flicked again and again toward the pulpit, and more precisely, to Violet. The moment arrived after the final hymn. As the last notes of Dear Lord and Father of Mankind faded, Reverend Albright announced that there would be a brief choir meeting in the vestry. Following the service, Violet did not turn her head. She simply followed the line of choristers down the side aisle and disappeared. Behind the velvet curtain, the man in pew 8 hesitated just a heartbeat too long, then rose. Miss Marple stepped into his path. Before he could reach the narthex, "I do hope you'll stay for tea this time," she said mildly. He looked at her with something between irritation and unease. "I've no time," he said. "You've made rather a habit of slipping away. People are beginning to notice." "I'm no one," he replied. "Just visiting. The church has meaning to me." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but it's what it means that matters." He stepped past her without another word, but she saw it. Just before he turned away, the glint of a brooch on his lapel, silver, shaped like a forget-me-not. The same brooch Violet's mother had once owned, and the same brooch Violet no longer wore. Miss Marple entered the vestry 10 minutes later. Violet was seated on the edge of a wooden pew, her hands clasped tightly. Reverend Albright stood nearby, pretending to rearrange a stack of hymnals. He was here again, Violet said without preamble. Miss Marple nodded. "You saw him?" "Of course I did. I couldn't sing a note. He's been following me since London. He leaves things, notes, items I lost years ago. He's not just trying to find me. He's trying to make me remember something." "Have you spoken to him?" "Once, briefly, months ago, outside a theater. I told him never to speak to me again." "Did you know who he was?" Violet's voice trembled. "Yes, he's my father." There it was, finally said aloud. "I only met him a few times growing up. He was always gone business trips, long absences. But when I turned 16, he reappeared, claimed he wanted to reconnect. My mother warned me not to trust him. She said he'd done something awful, something she never explained." Miss Marple glanced at Reverend Albright, who nodded once and slipped out, giving them privacy. Violet continued, voice flat. "He tried to control everything. Who I saw, where I went. At first, it was subtle, and then it wasn't. I left home when I was 19. He followed, then disappeared again. Until this. She looked up, eyes glassy but resolute. I think he's here to finish what he started. Miss Marple was quiet a long time. Then she said, "Do you know what happened to the brooch?" Violet blinked. He took it, said it was part of the past, that it belonged to him, not me. And the glove? I hadn't seen it until last Sunday, but I recognized it. It used to be his. Always carried a pair, even in summer. Miss Marple stood slowly. I believe we're looking at a man who isn't just returning to reclaim his daughter. He's returning to correct a memory, one he believes he can still shape. That makes him dangerous not in violence, necessarily, but in certainty. Violet looked up. Then what do I do? Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. You let him speak, and this time, you let him be heard by someone else. That evening, Miss Marple sent a note to Sergeant Lanning of the county police. Discreet, of course, containing no accusation, only a request that he attend next Sunday's service. In plain clothes, she also posted a second letter to Raymond. She needed confirmation of Peter Wendell's legal status, his estate, his guardianship history, anything that might tie him to Griffin. Street 10 to Arlington and Bray. The glove had been a calling card, but it had also been a warning dot, and Miss Marple intended to see what it was pointing toward before the man behind it vanished once again. Chapter 7. Something left in the vestry. Village awoke on Monday to the sound of distant hammering repairs at the church roof. The vicar had explained, but it only served to deepen the sense that something was unsettled in Lower Milchester. News of the stranger's third Sunday appearance had begun to percolate. Despite efforts by Reverend Albright and Miss Marple to keep the matter discreet, in a village this small, secrets ripened quickly. Miss Marple, however, ignored the chatter. She had a letter to wait for. It arrived with the 10 o'clock post, a small envelope in her nephew Raymond's handwriting. She opened it with care, slid the page free, and read it beside the fire. Dear Aunt Jane, as requested, I made some inquiries through a colleague who works with Arlington and Bray. Peter Wendell was indeed employed there many years ago, but his employment ended abruptly in 1946 following an internal scandal. Something to do with the misappropriation of client funds, never publicly charged, but quietly dismissed. He dropped off the records entirely in the early 50s. Some believed he'd left the country. There were rumors of a legal battle involving a trust fund for a minor child, likely Violet. The matter was closed, and the guardianship was passed to the child's mother and maternal aunt. The last official trace of Peter Wendell is from 1953. After that, nothing. Yours, Raymond. Miss Marple folded the letter, her expression unreadable. She had expected something of the sort. Vanishing men were rarely truly gone. They merely waited for the world to forget them before returning with rewritten stories. She turned to her notebook and added to the timeline, 1946, dismissed from Arlington and Bray, approximately 1953, final legal record. Guardianship transferred now, reappeared in Lower Milchester. Watching Violet, wearing her brooch, leaving notes and clues. Then she added a final line, intent unclear, reunion, or reclamation. She put the kettle on and allowed herself a moment to think. The problem wasn't just Peter Wendell's presence. It was his methods. The glove, the brooch, the diary fragment. This was not the behavior of someone seeking redemption. It was performance, message layered within message. And if his aim was to unsettle Violet, or worse, to bring her under some psychological control, it was working. Unless someone stopped it. At noon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage. Reverend Albright, who was in the middle of moving hymnals from one shelf to another for no discernible reason, offered her tea and an armchair without question. Has she said anything more? He asked Violet. No, Miss Marple replied. But I'm more interested now in what she hasn't said. Oh, she hasn't asked for help. She hasn't asked for protection. That worries me more than anything else. It suggests resignation. The vicar nodded soberly. You think he's coming back? I'm certain of it. And he will not be content with letters this time. They discussed plans for the next Sunday, the discreet involvement of Sergeant Lanning, a seat reserved near the vestry for observation, and a quiet signal Violet could use if she felt threatened. The vicar, though not a man made for intrigue, proved entirely willing to assist. She's a good girl, he said, and she's afraid. It was as Miss Marple was preparing to leave that the door to the vestry creaked open. It was the church cleaner, Mrs. Yarrow, a sturdy woman with little sense for subtlety and a perpetually damp apron. Beg pardon, Reverend, she said, holding up a folded cloth. But I found this tucked behind the vestment chest. Thought it odd. Didn't look like yours. She handed it to him. The vicar unfolded the cloth. Inside, wrapped as if carefully hidden, was a second glove, matching the one found 2 weeks earlier in Pew 8. Miss Marple stepped closer. Yes, she said. I rather thought we might find its partner. Reverend Albright looked puzzled. But why hide it? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She took the glove, turned it inside out with gentle fingers, and examined the lining. No note this time, no card. But there was something else, a name, faintly inked in the seam. P. Wendelsch held it up. He wanted us to find it, she murmured. Just not all at once. This is a trail, one he's set deliberately. The first glove left in plain sight. The second, hidden where only a very particular sort of person might stumble upon it. But why gloves? The vicar asked. Why not a letter? Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. Because gloves are worn, she said. They imply touch, closeness, and when hidden, they imply secrets. It's theatrical, symbolic. I believe he means Violet to discover all of this in stages, not for shock but for pressure, to make her feel as though her own memories are being unearthed. Psychological manipulation? Precisely. And if he follows the same pattern, there's more to come. They stood in silence for a moment, each imagining the next piece of the puzzle arriving quietly, perhaps in a hymn book, or slipped between notes on the organ bench. The church, sacred to most, had become a stage for something dark. Miss Marple returned home as the rain began to fall. She felt it settle into her coat like a chill premonition. Back in her parlor, she laid both gloves side by side and studied them. What disturbed her was not their presence. It was how deliberate their placement had been. Someone was controlling the tempo of this unfolding drama, and Miss Marple suspected the final act would not take place in a pew, or a choir stall, or even a church. It would take place when Violet was alone, and for that, Miss Marple would have to act not as a solver of puzzles, but as a guardian of the girl who had once believed she was being watched. Because now she was. Chapter 8. Beneath the organ pipes, the next few days passed in a quiet unease, the sort that left shopkeepers looking over shoulders, and the vicar hesitating before turning corners. Though no crime had been committed, nothing one could take to the magistrate or write in a report. The sense of danger in Lower Milchester was palpable, like thunder on a horizon that refused to arrive. Violet did not miss choir practice, nor did she avoid her usual walk from the dairy to the green. But there was a new tension in her steps. Miss Marple watched her once from behind the lace curtains of her sitting room, noting how the girl paused near every gate, checked every shadow twice. The gloves remained hidden in Miss Marple's bureau drawer, along with the photograph and both anonymous notes. She had considered handing them over to the police, but Sergeant Lanning, when consulted in confidence, had offered only a gentle shrug. Can't arrest a man for leaving his own gloves, Miss Marple. No, she'd replied. But sometimes the gloves speak louder than the hands. It was on Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the next Sunday service, that Miss Marple returned to St. Petronella's alone. She did not attend for prayers or for conversation. She had requested the spare key from the vicar that morning, under the pretense of placing a floral arrangement near the altar. Instead, she climbed the narrow stairwell behind the organ loft. The stairs creaked with old resentment. They had been used once a week for decades, and yet their steps never learned silence. At the top, Miss Marple emerged into the wooden passage behind the great pipes of the church organ. Dust lay thick on the beams and in the corners. Long dead wasps lay curled like punctuation. She moved carefully, running her gloved hand along the edge of the railing. Here, one could see the nave in full, though the angle was hidden by the curvature of the organ facade. From this perch, one could watch every face, every pew, every movement of the choir and vicar without ever being noticed. She found it quickly. A small wooden box, no larger than a loaf of bread, tucked between two support beams near the back wall. It was tied with twine. She opened it slowly. Inside, a folded piece of sheet music, a church program, and a brooch. The brooch silver, shaped like a forget-me-not. There was also a third note. Typed. Some songs are not meant to be sung twice. She wore this once. She forgot what it meant. I am the one who remembers. I will make her remember to. Miss Marple closed the box, her fingers trembling slightly. This was not just obsession, it was rehearsal. The man was preparing something, reconstructing memory piece by piece, manipulating Violet's surroundings to tighten around her like a noose. The brooch, the gloves, the diary scrap, they weren't just clues. They were props, set pieces in a cruel performance. Miss Marple took the items and returned the box to its hiding place, untouched, in case the man returned to check it. Then she descended the stairwell and locked the organ loft door behind her. At home, she wrote 3 letters, one to Sergeant Lanning, requesting his presence not just at the Sunday service, but in the organ loft. One to Raymond, asking for anything further about Peter Wendell's financial dealings or criminal record. And one, perhaps the most important, to Violet. She hand-delivered the last, slipping it through the front door at Mill Lane that evening. It read, "My dear Violet, you are stronger than you think. The shadows that frighten us most are often only reflections of our past, not our future. I ask only this: if he approaches you, if he speaks to you, do not run. Listen, but not alone." With warmth, J.M. 2 hours later, a knock came at Miss Marple's door. Violet stood there, coat buttoned to the neck, eyes red but dry. "I've decided," she said. "I'll confront him. Sunday, after the service." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You won't be alone." That Sunday arrived colder than the one before. The bells of St. Petronella's rang out across a brittle sky, and the village gathered in its familiar rows. Violet sang with the choir, her voice steady, her eyes forward. The stranger sat in pew 8 once more, but this time he was not alone in watching. Sergeant Lanning crouched silently behind the organ pipes above, armed not with handcuffs, but with a notebook and a quiet resolve. Miss Marple, seated in the third pew, observed everything: the way the man adjusted his collar when Violet stood to sing, the way he folded his hands too tightly during the Lord's Prayer, after the final hymn. As the congregation filed out into the cold, Violet stepped into the side chapel where the tea urn was always placed. She stood beside it, alone, and as expected, the man followed. Miss Marple moved toward the archway and watched from the shadows, not interfering, only listening. "You read my notes," he said, voice low and sure. "Yes," Violet replied. "And the brooch. I remember it. You wore it when you were 8, he said. "You said it made you feel grown up. You gave it to me," she said. "Then you took it back." "I had to. Your mother, she twisted everything." "You're not here for reconciliation," Violet said. "You're here for control." He hesitated. Miss Marple stepped forward then, her tone gentle. "No more performances, Mr. Wendell. No more props. This is not your stage. The man turned, eyes narrowing. "You have no right. I have every right." Miss Marple replied, "To protect a young woman who came here seeking safety. And I believe your brooch, which you had no right to remove from her possessions, is quite enough to begin a legal inquiry." Behind her, Sergeant Lanning stepped out from the vestry. Notepad in hand, Peter Wendell looked around. At the stone walls of the church, the open door, the gathering witnesses, and said nothing. He walked out without another word, and this time, he did not return. Chapter 9, A Memory Buried. A truth unearthed following morning dawned with the peculiar hush that often follows storms. Not storms of weather, but of emotion. Lower Milchester carried on as if nothing had happened. The milkman clattered his way through the lanes. The vicar polished his Sunday sermon notes. And the village baker was already grumbling about a shortage of strong flour. But in the quiet parlor of Miss Marple's home on Elmsworth Crescent, things were far from settled. Violet sat curled in the armchair by the window, nursing a second cup of tea. Her cheeks were pale, though the swelling of resolve had not quite left her gaze. She looked years older than the girl who had sung in St. Petronella's choir just days ago. Miss Marple was crocheting, not for warmth but for thought. Each stitch, like a sentence in a well-constructed argument, formed slowly and without haste. "So," Violet said at last, "he'll go back to wherever he came from, and that's it." Miss Marple didn't look up. Not quite. Sergeant Lanning sent word this morning. Mr. Wendell was questioned formally in Radstock. He denies stealing the brooch, but his luggage says otherwise. Violet's lips pressed into a line. The notes, the glove, the music box, all part of some twisted message. She asked. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and not for the public, but for you, to revive something best left undisturbed. You must understand, my dear, some people cannot bear to be forgotten. For them, memory is control." Violet nodded slowly. "He was my piano teacher, you know, years ago when I was just a child. My mother thought it would build character. He always stood too close." Miss Marple's crochet paused for the briefest moment. "And did you ever speak of it?" "No," Violet whispered. "Not then. Not really ever." A silence bloomed between them, thick and unashamed. The kind of silence only age or injury can earn. "I do remember that brooch," Violet said. "He gave it to me after a recital. I was 9. I wore it until Mummy found it and took it away. There was an argument, one of the loud ones." Miss Marple placed her work gently in the basket at her feet. "He wasn't just trying to frighten you," she said. "He wanted you to acknowledge him, validate his version of the past. A small man clinging to a time when he had power over someone. And now he's gone," Violet said. "But why do I feel as if something still doesn't fit?" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Because, my dear, it doesn't." She rose and crossed to her writing desk. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a manila envelope. Within it were the 2 typed notes and the original diary scrap Violet had first brought. "Read them again," she instructed. "Aloud, if you please." Violet unfolded the first note. "You wore this once. You forgot what it meant. I am the one who remembers." She read the second. "Some songs are not meant to be sung twice. She wore this once. She forgot what it meant. I will make her remember to dot." Then she paused. "Wait, she asked. The first says you. The second says she." Miss Marple gave a small nod of approval. "Precisely. The voice shifts. The writer is no longer addressing you but speaking about you. But they were both typed." Violet said. "Same paper, same font." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not the same mind. I believe Peter Wendell may have been a cruel, self-pitying manipulator, but not particularly clever. You think someone else was involved?" Violet asked. "Not just involved," said Miss Marple. "I think someone else added fuel to the fire, knowing exactly what it would do to you." She moved to the bookshelf and retrieved a slim volume of poetry, The Ivy Wall and Other Verses. From the flyleaf, a pressed violet petal slid onto the table. "You found this among your mother's old things?" Miss Marple asked. Violet blinked. "Yes, I didn't think anything of it. She loved pressed flowers." Miss Marple handed her the petal, brittle and browned. "This isn't from your mother. Not originally. Look at the tissue, it's pressed in cheap hotel stationery. See the imprint?" Violet turned the paper under the light. The ghost of an embossed name appeared faintly, the Sunningdale Arms. Miss Marple continued, "A place frequented by a woman named Clara Wingate, the same Clara who once worked for your family as a companion. Your mother let her go under vague circumstances when you were about 11, if memory serves." Violet looked stunned. "Yes, but what does she have to do with?" "She and Mr. Wendell were acquainted. More than acquainted. A brief affair just before she left town. And from what I gather," Miss Marple added gently, "Clara always felt your mother ruined her life." Violet fell silent. "She couldn't harm your mother directly," Miss Marple said. "So she turned to you. I believe she reconnected with Wendell through correspondence, nudged his bitterness into action, made him believe he had a right to revisit the past. Perhaps she even sent the second note herself, to make me feel hunted," Violet murmured, "and to discredit me, in case I ever remembered." Miss Marple sighed. "Vengeance is often more precise than justice." Clara knew where to press. The fire crackled in the grate. Violet looked down at the petal in her hand. Then it was never just about him. It was about them, about a memory someone needed to bury and someone else wanted to resurrect. Miss Marple nodded. "To people using the same memory for very different purposes. You were caught between their needs." The room grew still again. "What happens now?" Violet asked. "We speak to Sergeant Lanning," Miss Marple said. "And you begin again. Not as a victim, but as a woman who saw through shadows and found her way back." Violet looked up. Her eyes no longer held the tremble of uncertainty. They held steel. Chapter 10. The Pew That Held a Memory. It was a Sunday again when the village of Lower Milchester returned to St. Petronella's. The storm had passed, though. Not the one carried in the clouds, and the church pews filled with regulars, wearing their best coats, their best hats, and their most watchful expressions. The sun streamed through the stained glass in dignified silence, as if reluctant to disturb the fresh unease settling across the sanctuary. Violet sat beside Miss Marple in the third pew from the front, a single pressed violet petal resting between the pages of her hymnal. She did not sing, she did not weep, but her hands were still. Behind them, Sergeant Lanning stood near the entrance, not in uniform, but unmistakably official. He had been there since dawn, scanning each face as it arrived. It was he who had arranged for Clara Wingate to attend that morning service. Under the polite pretext of wishing to pay respects, she came in shortly after the bells stopped, dressed in dove gray, her gloved hands folded tightly before her. Clara slid into the sixth pew on the left without a glance around the nave. Her eyes were focused, unmoving, but her shoulders betrayed her dot as the final hymn faded. The vicar offered his customary benediction. "Go in peace and serve one another in truth and humility." The congregation began to stir, the rustle of coats and hymnals like the wings of a nesting flock. But before they could file out, Miss Marple turned in her seat and spoke clearly, not loudly, but with the sort of crisp certainty that parted the air like a blade. "Miss Wingate, might I have a word before you go?" Heads turned. A few gasps were smothered with gloved hands. Clara froze. "I beg your pardon. It won't take long," Miss Marple said sweetly. "Just a matter of confirming the truth you've been clutching for far too long." Sergeant Lanning stepped forward and gestured to the vestry. "Let's speak privately." The room behind the altar smelled of cedar and candle wax. Miss Marple, Violet, Clara, and Sergeant Lanning formed a quiet circle round the polished table used for communion. "Preparations." Miss Marple began. There are two kinds of lies, Miss Wingate. Those that bend the truth, and those that hide it entirely. You've become quite skilled in both. Clara looked away, chin high. I don't know what you mean. You wrote the second note, Miss Marple said gently. The one that shifted the voice from you to she. It was a clever touch, suggesting the note was meant for someone else, even though you were directing it at Violet the whole time. You used the same typewriter as Peter Wendell, conveniently giving the illusion of consistency. But the language, that betrayed you. I had no contact with him, Clara said stiffly. You had plenty, a shared history, shared resentment, even a shared brooch one he once gave to Violet, which you took after Mrs. Hartley's death. You knew what it would mean when it turned up again. Clara flinched. You wanted her to remember. Miss Marple continued, not for her sake, but for yours, because it pained you that no one had acknowledged your grievance, that you'd been erased from the story. So you ensured your place in it. She ruined my life, Clara whispered. Your bitterness made you blind, Miss Marple said, her voice now tinged with quiet sorrow. You thought revenge would heal the wound, but all you did was reopen Violet's. Sergeant Lanning stepped forward. Miss Wingate, based on Miss Marple's account and the supporting evidence, we'll need you to come with us for formal questioning. There may be charges related to harassment, coercion, and the use of false documents. Clara's face crumpled not in rage, but in defeat, a long, tired sort of collapse. She didn't protest as Lanning led her away. When the door closed, Miss Marple turned to Violet. It is not a perfect ending, but justice, like memory, is rarely tidy. Violet nodded. Thank you. I don't know what might have happened if, but you do know, Miss Marple interrupted softly. You would have endured. You were already enduring. Outside, the village moved on. Church bells rang once more, this time marking not a service, but the echo of truth reclaimed. Miss Marple and Violet stepped into the bright morning light, where roses bloomed beside the churchyard fence, and the scent of freshly cut grass curled through the breeze dot as they walked together toward the green. Violet turned to her companion. I don't suppose you ever doubt yourself, do you, Miss Marple? Oh, I doubt many things, the old woman said with a smile, but never the nature of people. They always tell you who they are if you know how to listen. The wind stirred the trees. A single violet petal, caught on a breeze, fluttered up from the path and drifted away. Epilogue. Tea beneath the rowan tree. It was 3 weeks later, when Miss Marple returned to St. Petronella's garden for tea, though this time there were no scones, no hymns, and no unexpected notes. The rowan tree at the edge of the churchyard cast a dappled shade over the bench where she sat. A small wicker basket beside her filled with embroidery and a single book of verse. The village had, as it always did, resumed its gentle routines. Mrs. Tapping was seen rearranging begonias outside the post office. Young Jacob Hartley had been overheard practicing his organ scales in the rectory, less gloomily than usual, it was said, and Violet Denham, now a quieter fixture of Lower Milchester, had taken up her old volunteer work at the library, her posture straighter, her smile a touch more certain. Clara Wingate's departure had been understated. After a brief police inquiry and a confession made in confidence, she had left for a relative's home in Dorset to recover her nerves. No charges were filed. Violet had declined to pursue any. It's enough to know, she had said simply, that she was seen. Miss Marple understood. Vindication, after all, was not always about punishment. Sometimes it was about restoration, the quiet return of what had been taken, peace, memory, dignity. She sipped her tea slowly, watching a robin bounce through the grass. It pecked at something unseen, paused, then darted away in a flutter. Everything in the village had resumed its place. But Miss Marple knew that no place, however tranquil, was truly untouched. Each fence had its lean, each smile its shadow, and each pew in that old church now held more than just a cushion and a hymnal. It held the memory of a glove left behind, noticed, and understood from inside the church. The soft notes of the organ began again, threading through the warm air. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, the music stirring gently in her chest like a quiet tide. She opened her book and turned to a page marked with a dried violet. Some petals are too stubborn to wither, and some truths, like them, press themselves gently into the corners of memory, fragile, but never lost.